Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Environment Virginia on a beautiful spring day. It is spring actually now, and great day to be out on the post at VMI. And we are here at the Virginia DEQ update. My name is Jeff Steers. I'm the Director of Central Operations and Acting Enforcement Director for the agency. And today we've got a panel of folks that are going to, our division directors and our director, to cover topics that will be most riveting for everyone that's here today. You'll be glad you came early and started Environment Virginia with us today. We're going to have presentations first, some opening remarks from Director Paylor, and he will also be Mike Dowd today, our Air Division Director who couldn't join us. So he will be giving the Air Division update, followed by Justin Williams, the Director of our Land Protection and Revitalization Division, who will give some updates from his division and programs, followed by Jutta Schneider, who is the Water Planning Division Director, and then Melanie Davenport, our Water Permitting Division Director, will give some updates. And when we're done, we have plenty of time, so we're hoping for some really good questions and interaction, so we'll have plenty of time to do that. This is a 2-hour session that goes on till 3 o'clock, so make sure you jot down your questions and don't be shy. So first I'm going to turn it over to David and he can start us out. And I'll load the air one for when you're ready, which is right here. There it goes.
Maybe. Yeah, okay, thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. Guess I need to stand up so I can see what I'm talking about, and it's you can pretend that I'm Mike Dowd when the time comes. Just to give a little bit of sort of overview of a few things that are going on at DEQ before I get into the Air Division stuff. I guess I would say too, this is the first full year since Governor Northam took office, and I just want to say that he and Secretary Strickler have been really hugely supportive of the environmental agendas and helping us to advance our environmental agenda in so many different ways. And I just want to give my gratitude to the administration. I think you know that at the outset of the administration, actually he was here last year, and the governor indicated his support for what actually ends up to be, if he gets there, tripling the amount of money that goes to natural resources. He said 2%, we're at 0.6% right now. And we didn't get as much money in this budget as he had asked for, but we got more than we have gotten in many a year, close to $1 million. Most of it focused on communications things, getting a much more interactive and useful website in place, developing a service portal so that so that folks can execute transactions with the department online. So that's sort of our first step. I know that the governor and the secretary very much want to really take a lot of the ideas that came out of Executive Order 6 and try to build those into next year's budget. So that's a stay tuned situation to see what the revenues look like and what the opportunities are. But I'm really just very gratified to have a governor that very much wants to help rebuild some of the capacity that maybe DEQ has lost over the years. In the world of capacity, one of the things that he asked me very, very early on was, how much money have you lost? And since 2001, DEQ's lost $46 million, I think is the number, of general fund money. And so we are going to do everything that we can, I know that he is as well, to try to rebuild some of the capacity that's been lost over the years. So we're really grateful for that. So what's been going on with DEQ? Nothing but pipelines. And I'm not going to address pipelines right now. If you have any pipeline questions for us at the Q&A session, I'll be happy to take them at that time. And then, environmental justice has been a big issue that has, you've seen come up. It came up in the context of the Buckingham compressor station, but it also has been coming up in a broader context over the years, and that's an issue that we are going to be developing more of a program for and understanding of, not only for ourselves, but for the public at large. What is environmental justice and what are DEQ's responsibilities in that regard? And we actually expect within the next week or so to be looking for, to have a solicitation out to bring some outside help in to help us evaluate what are the environmental justice needs, opportunities, and obligations that DEQ has, and perhaps others like local governments have in the context of environmental justice as well. So that's a thing writ large that we're looking at. And then I'll just make a passing reference to the fact that workforce development is really a thing at DEQ that we've got to pay attention to. That's not unique to DEQ. That's not unique to state government writ large. In fact, I was just looking at an article this morning about how difficult it is for state agencies to recruit well. And some of that is a difference in focus and life expectations that that newer, younger generations have than perhaps my generation had. One of the things that the article said was that millennials, I'll just say, don't have a career goal that is linear necessarily. And so we've got, and everybody has in the workplace now, 3 to 5 generations with different sets of expectations about what the workplace is like and what it should be like and how we meet their needs. And we have at DEQ something like 30% of the agency that could retire today if they chose to. And so we've got to really pay attention to hiring people that will buy into the mission, giving them reasons to stay. And so workforce development is a real focus that we need to have because we want to have continuity through the next generations for environmental protection as well. So that's really kind of all I'll say in terms of an overview of DEQ. I'm happy to take any questions when we get to that point about anything that I may have missed. And I will jump into the air overview. I don't know as much as Mike Dowd. That may be good, that may be bad, I don't know. But I'll give you a little bit of an overview there. And before I get into air, I'll just say I could talk about groundwater protection. I could talk about the Bay. I could talk about a number of other things, and these folks over here would think I'm stealing their thunder, so I'm going to leave it to them to talk about those larger issues. I will just say about groundwater, because that was sort of a personal goal of mine over the last 2 or 3 years. The coastal aquifer is one that we're using at twice the sustainable rate. And we have successfully, as of about a year ago, worked with the 14 largest users who represent 90% of the permitted withdrawal to reduce their dependence on the aquifer by an average of 50 little bit more than 50% over the next 10 years. So we've taken huge steps towards stabilizing the coastal aquifer, and that's really been a gratifying thing. And if I stole that from you, Jutta, I'm sorry. So let's talk about air a little bit. And the big thing in the air world is our carbon cap and trade initiative that's underway. Climate initiatives. It was started by Executive Directive 11 under Governor McAuliffe. He asked us to develop a cap and trade rule for the electric power generating facilities. Wanted it to be trading ready and linkable to other states. One of the, I think, real principles behind linkable to other states was that makes, theoretically, that makes it a little bit less of a market challenge because you have more states with whom you can trade and sell, buy and sell. And the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is the trading ready organization that exists. A number of Northeast states have been in this for some time, and it's been operating for 10 years. So at this point, it's functionally very well established. And so that was what his focus was, and then directed us to use our existing authority to develop the initiative. So we have a proposed regulation that has closed public notice. It's actually been out to public notice a couple of times now, with some changes in the cap and some other things, it will go to the Air Pollution Control Board on April 19th with some final recommendations from us, and we will propose adoption of that regulation. Its goal is to have a 30%, to start at a ceiling of 28 million tons from the electric generating units, and have a 30% reduction by 2030, 3% a year. This is not unlike some other criteria pollutants that we have. Sulfur dioxide has got a cap and trade program. This one is based on the RGGI model. And to modify it to meet, to live within existing authority and to meet our specific needs, the principal thing is that we are using what's called a consignment auction. That means that in all of the other RGGI states, the revenues from the auction flows to the state and is used in various ways. Under a consignment auction, the revenue from the auction will flow back to the facilities, the generating facilities. So we will assign credits, allocations to each of the EGUs using a formula, and then they will be required to put those into the auction. They will be reimbursed for any of the credits, the allocation that they put into the auction, and then if they need to purchase more, they will that will cost them, but any of that would be without cost. That was a part of what they put into the auction to begin with. And then we have a 5% set aside for energy efficiency. That'll go over to DMME and will be used to develop some energy efficiency programs as it's proposed right now. Just to give you a little bit of a flavor, this is what carbon dioxide emissions have looked like in the power sector in Virginia. Virginia Power, I think, means not Dominion, but Virginia, all the power industries in Virginia. And you see it fluctuates a lot. A lot of that fluctuation is based on, has been based on economy. If you look at 2012, that was particularly, we're just coming out of the Great Recession, and so it's fluctuated a lot, but it is projected to have a continual downward trend. And the RGGI rule would look like this if it takes effect, and would have us at a little bit under 20 million tons 10 years from now, with that being a 30% reduction. So other climate initiatives that we have underway, one of them is the Volkswagen settlement. If you remember, Volkswagen sort of cheated on their emissions in their cars, and had the computer read some results that weren't factual. And EPA negotiated a fairly significant settlement with them as part of their enforcement action, and that results in a little bit more than $90 million coming to Virginia for a number of clean air initiatives, where the first thing out of the gate has been, I think, in the range of about $14 million that is being used to put charging facilities along our major interstate, most used interstate corridors. So if you got an electric car, when you pull off at the rest stop, you can recharge it. And then we're also looking now at funding all electric buses. We've probably committed about less than 30 million of the total, and we will be continuing to look particularly at the EV transit sector for how to use that money. We have joined the Transportation Climate Initiative. That's just sort of, I'll call it a nascent initiative with 8 or 9 states, again, many of them in the Northeast, to begin to look at ways that we can lower the carbon footprint of the transportation sector. And it's just getting started, and that group of states is beginning to have conversations about what's possible. And so that's going on right now. We are also, the governor has directed us to, as the next step in climate beyond our RGGI, entering into the RGGI team, we will be looking at ways to regulate methane. Methane, as most of you know, is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2 is, and on the order of 23 times more heat trapping than carbon dioxide is. Not as long lived, but still plenty long to live for your life and mine. And so we actually just yesterday convened our first work group to begin to look again at what's possible in the methane sector to reduce fugitive and other kinds of methane emissions that haven't been regulated heretofore. You may remember that EPA had a rule on the books, and that is not now on the books. The current administration has pulled that back. So we are taking the lead to try to determine what Virginia ought to do in that space as well. And then, as many of you know, back in 2018, the power sector legislation had a significant investment in renewable energy, clean energy, and energy efficiency. We're seeing more and more in the renewable energy sector, especially solar. There's a little bit going on with offshore wind, but the cost of solar energy continues to drop, and one of the reasons that we have been able to project under RGGI that our cap could start at 28 and could meet the reductions that we look at is because we see the renewable energy sector just getting more and more capacity and more viable over the years. That's really been moving fast. So this is just, did it not, oh, sorry. I've got two of these on my screen, and I don't know which one I'm looking at. Air pollutant emissions continue to decrease. I've got a graph for this that comes next, but regional utility controls have been a big reason. A big reason has been there's more natural gas, there's less coal than there was. Natural gas is, per BTU, is half the CO2 emissions of coal, and it's also much lower with NOx and a number of other things as well. I mentioned that we're having a steady increase in renewable generation. Cars are just getting cleaner and cleaner. That's actually been one of the real, in Northern Virginia, our ozone concentrations have just been way lower than I ever thought they could be, and we're practically meeting the standard of 70 today. And when I started in the air business in '95, the standard was 120. The mobile sector is a huge reason, a huge source of ozone precursors, and with cars getting cleaner and cleaner, it really has helped Northern Virginia. And then there have been a number of other state and federal programs that have helped as well. This is a graphic representation of what's been going on for air emissions since 2005. So that is a dramatic reduction in all of our criteria pollutants. The main ones you see down there at the bottom are nitrogen oxide, particulates, sulfur, and volatile organic carbons. So this is another graph that essentially shows you the same thing. So just wanted to crow a little bit about all the progress that has been made in air pollution control over the years, and we expect to see that continue. So my next slide says questions, but are we going to save those till the end? Okay, thanks.
Okay, next up is Justin Williams, and here we are. Take it away.
Good afternoon. I'm Justin Williams, Land Protection Revitalization Division Director. And if you're wondering or couldn't tell, our order is entirely decided by how long our division name is. So being Land Protection Revitalization, I got next in the draw. I want to start out talking a little bit just about solid waste in Virginia. That's obviously one of the areas that fall within our the purview of the Land Division, and our consistency in terms of the overall amounts that we're continuing to see in terms of solid waste disposal in the Commonwealth. This number breaks out from the 2017 Virginia Solid Waste Information Assessment Report, which is the most recent report finalized based on the timing of when facilities report based on the fiscal year, or calendar year rather. And that number continues to average around a typical total of 20 million tons in Virginia. And you can see that through this graph, which is really just the trends over the last 6 years in terms of solid waste disposal in the Commonwealth. What this does is continue to show that it is steady overall, but we did obviously see an uptick in terms of the total amount of solid waste disposed of generated in the Commonwealth versus those coming from out of state. Comparatively, historically, this number is obviously less than it has been significantly in the past, and actually also the states that represent the total amount of solid waste that comes in from out of state to be disposed of in the Commonwealth has shifted as well. Focusing more on most of the out-of-state waste coming in the Mid-Atlantic region, including our state to the south and slightly to the north. We couple the solid waste disposal with looking at the recycling amount in the Commonwealth. Obviously, recycling is a very important and hot topic right now, given all the issues that have been going on. In particular, the ban that's frequently talked about, or you might have heard about in China, based on the incoming recyclable materials that had previously been going there, particularly from West Coast states and facilities, but just across the board in the United States has become more of an immediate and pressing issue. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we're looking at that when I talk about the recycling evaluation that we're doing at DEQ. But as of now, with the most recent recycling rate report again, which is still going to be slightly delayed based on the reporting amounts, our total recycling rate continues to hover around 42%. Obviously, that varies significantly throughout the Commonwealth. We see some jurisdictions, particularly in Northern Virginia, who reach far above 40%, somewhere of 70 or 80%, and other localities in different parts of the state that are able to still maintain or meet the state minimum of 25% or 15% respectively. But overall, the combined rate is continued to hover around 42% in the Commonwealth. So that's a little bit of a purview on where we are with solid waste generally. Obviously, what we're seeing between the conversations we'll be having about recycling and looking at that solid waste disposal, the types and numbers of facilities that we have in this Commonwealth continue to shift as well. We do not have as many open, active landfills as we've had historically. Typically, now most landfills are focused more on expansions, and we're seeing new facilities. And conversely, the number of material recovery facilities or transfer stations that we've had in the state continues to grow as well. And that's consistent with the total amount of waste and recycling that's continued to occur as well. On the haz waste side, I just wanted to touch on some of the rules and regulations. There's been a lot of activity going on in haz waste of late out of EPA. A lot of it has been long-time rulemaking activities that are finally coming to fruition or finalized. One of the most significant was the Hazardous Waste Generator Improvement Rule. This was a multi-year rulemaking effort that was the most significant and largest revision to the hazardous waste regulations since their inception. It did everything from change the nomenclature for the type of generators to change operational requirements dealing with issues like episodic generation or those who might tip a certain generator amount in a given month and how that has to be handled. We in the Commonwealth have adopted this rule and incorporated it, and in fact we did training sessions, 6 of them throughout the Commonwealth, as well as a webinar. That webinar is available on our website if you want to go look at and go into all the individual nuances of this rulemaking. And also Leslie Romanchik will be here on Thursday offering a session talking about this rulemaking as well if you want to learn some more of the specifics in and out of that. EPA has also moved forward with the e-manifesting system and rolling that out. What this does is essentially transition all of the manifesting for hazardous waste in the country from a paper-based format to an electronic-based format. And that rule had a deadline based on Congress setting a time frame for that to be implemented that EPA was pushing forward to meet and has done so. What it does still allow is some opportunity for paper manifesting, but once it's completely and fully implemented, this will provide not only a tremendous opportunity for efficiency for generators and disposal facilities, but also allow agencies like DEQ to be able to better track and ensure compliance with hazardous waste management throughout the Commonwealth and the country as well. So that rule has continued to move forward. There was also a proposed rulemaking beginning last year in March on aerosol cans. As those who dealt with this particular waste stream are aware, they present a unique challenge given the quantity that can be produced in the unique places that that you might see aerosol cans produced as a waste stream. So EPA is looking at that in terms of how to best determine some management standards for the management of aerosol cans. And then most recently, the final rulemaking that came out from EPA was the Pharmaceutical Rule. This was another major revision looking at a very particular and challenging area of hazardous waste management, which is pharmaceuticals. It becomes effective August 21st of this year, and I'll put a little bit more detail on this because it is, we are currently in the process of evaluating and moving forward with looking at incorporation of this rule. One of the most significant things it does in terms of the prohibitions is, in fact, it does incorporate to the regulations across the board ban on sewer disposal of pharmaceuticals. This has been an issue that we've looked at and worked with folks on before. So what EPA has done throughout the country, and regardless of states' adoption of any of the other provisions of this rule, that ban goes into effect upon the effective date. Some of the other things that this rule does is focus particularly on nicotine products, over-the-counter replacement therapies, as you might know them, lodge patches and so forth, on how to manage those. Nicotine, for those of you who are aware of the hazardous waste rules, was when it's unused in acute hazardous waste, which based on the quantity could trip some pretty significant requirements for a very small quantity. EPA wanted to focus in on these particular products because obviously they are pretty ubiquitous. You can go to any CVS or Walgreens and pick up one of these products, but when unused, presented some real challenges in terms of the management. So what it does is kind of provide some pathways for that particular product to be managed, both appropriately, but still do so in a more straightforward way for folks to be able to handle that waste stream. It also deals with other areas of pharmaceuticals as well, and particularly wanting to address the issue in the universe of reverse distribution or reverse logistics. So these are essentially pharmaceutical take-back programs with pharmacies and so forth, and making sure that obviously wanting to encourage appropriate recycling or reuse, and not actually allow, though, for these reverse distribution systems to be engaging in illegitimate recycling. So it provides some better clarity on the definition and requirements for that, some operational requirements for pharmaceuticals. It also deals with one area that was a particular concern of overlap and needing clarity, which was the take-back programs for DEA controlled substances. So these would be the take-back days that you might have seen in pharmacies or elsewhere, or through the mail system, and providing some clarity to make sure those opportunities continue to exist for DEA to be able to manage those controlled substances under that take-back program. On the brownfield side, I wanted to touch a large part on our voluntary remediation program, which continues to grow. We had 32 new applications in the past year, which is the largest number of applications we've ever received. I think that this is hopefully both a sign of continued economic development, but also a keen understanding of the importance and value of redeveloping these brownfield sites. One of the elemental parts of this program and benefits that we have is the combined funding available through EPA and the state to help spur some redevelopment. In this past year, EPA granted $2.4 million in grants to Virginia sites. One of the interesting things about that is this year, for the first time, DEQ, in partnership with the Mount Rogers Planning District Commission, actually got a grant, which was the first time we had separately applied as an entity to do so. And really the purpose of that and the $300,000 that we received is going to be working with that Planning District Commission to help focus in brownfield redevelopment in Southwest Virginia, and providing some greater opportunity for doing that. It's part of a larger effort that we focused in on in that area. Last year we hosted for the first time the Central Appalachian Regional Brownfields Initiative Network Summit, or CABIN for short. I think they did everything they can to make sure that acronym worked. But it was an excellent opportunity, and that summit and network brings together 7 different states to focus in on redevelopment opportunities in the Appalachian region. So we really wanted to use this opportunity through grant funding and partnership, particularly with West Virginia, to help focus on redevelopment in the Appalachian region in Virginia. We've also been able to focus in and continue additional funding, including targeted brownfields assistance grants, and actually the Virginia Brownfields Restoration and Economic Redevelopment Assistance Fund grants. We've been fortunate that the past few years the General Assembly has continued to fund the Virginia Brownfields Initiative grants, both in terms of being able to provide opportunity for funding for site assessments, but also to provide funding opportunities for remediation activities as well. Reuse and redevelopment continues to be a big focus in all of our remediation programs, be it Brownfield, Superfund, or RCRA. As many of you may know who work in the hazardous waste realm, the RCRA 2020 goal is fast upon us. We've been very fortunate in Virginia that we, by virtue of working with EPA and the folks we have on staff, Virginia will have met all of its 2020 goals for implementing RCRA corrective action or establishing a remedy at those sites. We've actually taken on additional sites from EPA to help expedite those cleanups. But another element of this program is going to be looking beyond 2020. There still remains other RCRA sites that need cleanup, and we've already started those conversations with EPA to help expedite and move forward with those cleanups as well. So I mentioned I was going to talk a little bit more about recycling, and in fact, I wanted to touch on a specific piece of legislation that we're addressing right now, which was Senate Bill 218 that was passed last year. What this bill did was to provide some definitions of beneficial use, beneficiation facility, and recycling center. It also incorporates beneficial use into other provisions. And one of the important elements that this bill did was to identify recycling centers and beneficiation facilities as manufacturers for grant processes or grant purposes, because apparently, based on that characterization, it's a significant impact to the grant funding that might be available to those facilities, so that helped to remove a hurdle for them to be able to receive economic grant and tax benefits. One of the other important parts of this legislation was that it requires DEQ to study the recycling market, incentives, and mixed waste facilities and produce a report by November 1st, 2019 of this year. Obviously, with everything that's been going on with recycling, both at the higher national levels and internationally with the China ban, to information we've seen and probably most of you have seen in the newspapers of various localities, this evaluation comes at a critical time. We have already sent out information requests and received some feedback from industry, localities, and others, but we're going to continue to engage in some listening sessions and stakeholder engagement. We really want to make sure that we're able to use this evaluation opportunity to provide back to the General Assembly a clear picture of what's going on with recycling, as well as some ideas that the legislature or others could consider to help improve recycling in the Commonwealth. And there, as many of you may be aware, there's a session as well during Environment Virginia talking about the future of recycling that I think will hit on this issue more as well. And last but not least, certainly an issue most, if not all of you are probably familiar with and you've heard us talk a tremendous amount about, but obviously seen a lot about in the Commonwealth, and that is coal combustion residuals, or coal ash as it's commonly known. So just to catch everybody up, if you haven't been following the timeline on some of the historical activities, there were two previous bills largely focused at looking at closure of certain coal ash units, particularly coal ash surface impoundments in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And what those previous legislative activities did was to put a moratorium on some of the closure permitting that could move forward dealing with those units. And then in the last previous General Assembly session actually extended that moratorium and then also required Dominion, who owned or operated those coal combustion surface impoundments or coal ash ponds in Chesapeake Bay, to put together a beneficial use option proposals out, and then to submit a business plan in the previous year for consideration by this General Assembly. And I'll talk a little bit about the results of that after I touch on what EPA was busy doing in the meantime. EPA went forward with some of its additional rulemaking. Previously, it had, in response to a court action, vacated certain provisions related to inactive impoundments, but then also as a part of the WIN Act, which was federal legislation that recognized the ability for EPA or state permitting programs, took other rulemaking actions and proposed some revisions back in March of last year. They finalized those in August. The Commonwealth of Virginia sent EPA a letter as a part of that commenting period, asking them not to take any rulemaking activity that would be less stringent than the original rule. EPA did so anyway, and actually provided some flexibilities or alternatives, including development of their own groundwater protection standards that would be different than background or MCL for groundwater during that rulemaking. As of this point, and based on our review, DEQ does not plan on incorporating these less stringent revisions that were made by EPA. So the CCR rule that's been incorporated as it is of now in the solid waste management reg will be as stringent as it was previous to this rulemaking. EPA is still considering some additional rulemaking and what they're referring to as phase 2. Obviously, as that rulemaking goes forward, we'll take a look at that in terms of both its stringency and any consistency with our laws or requirements. So just this past year, and I'm sure you'll hear more about this initiative and activity as well this week, that was supported by the governor, Senate Bill 1355 and House Bill 2786, was passed addressing coal combustion residuals and touching on primarily how these units will be closed in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Specifically, it addresses 4 sites that you all may be familiar with: the Bremo Bluff Power Station, Chesapeake Energy Center, Chesterfield Power Station, and Possum Point. In terms of the closure, that legislation essentially provides 2 options for those units. and specifically prohibits them being closed in place. It requires that it has to be either disposed of in a landfill that is lined, similar to the modern sanitary landfills, or that it has to be beneficially used in a recycling process that is encapsulated recycling. It also provides a beneficial use minimum, so there has to be 6.8 million cubic yards that is beneficially reused from at least 2 sites under the legislation as well. So the coal combustion residuals or coal ash will have to be beneficially reused from at least 2 of those 4 sites. It also has some other additional elements that will be required and factor into some of the calculus in terms of the disposal or recycling efforts, one of which is a transportation plan that's required if there's any off-site trucking for the activities to remove the coal ash. It also requires that Dominion look at the opportunity and ability to use local labor. It also has rate impact provisions in terms of the total amount that essentially can be charged per customer for the recovery for removal of coal ash. And then there's a consistent reporting element both to the General Assembly and others, as well as continued effort to evaluate the options for recycling for any coal ash that might have otherwise been planned for disposal under those provisions. And now mine says questions, so that's cue for the end.
Thank you, Justin. Okay, next on deck is Jutta Schneider, and she's the Director of the Water Planning Division, and I think we're good. Here we go.
Thank you, Jim. Good afternoon, everybody. It's definitely an interesting spread of seat allocation here across, so. All right, so I'm going to talk to you today about water quality and water supply. David mentioned the Chesapeake Bay Phase 3 Watershed Implementation Plan, and I don't have any slides on that. As you all know, we've been working over the last year or so very closely with Secretary Strickler and Deputy Secretary Jennings, as well as a number of other agencies and numerous stakeholders across the Commonwealth on developing this plan. And there is, as you will have seen when you take a look at the program, a separate session on that on Wednesday that will give you all the details that you want to know, or maybe more. And I would encourage you all to attend that session and be prepared to actively engage in a dialogue on the Phase 3 WIP. Unlike David and Justin, I didn't bring any charts or graphs, but I did bring some pretty pictures just to kind of show, what the staff sometimes gets to experience when they go out and monitor our waters or, collect data for us, remind us all about the resources that we're trying to protect, and show you some of the tools that we get to use. The topics that I'm going to talk about here today in the water quality arena, are the water quality standards and our water quality assessments. There's a lot more going on, and certainly be happy to answer any questions about any other topics, but those are the ones that seemed most pressing and imminent. I'll start with the James River chlorophyll criteria. This is a long ongoing process. I mentioned it last year, I believe, and we are getting close to developing a proposal to take to the State Water Control Board for approval. We have received approval last September to take the proposal to public comment. And we have completed that process with a public hearing in February here, and the comment period just closed the end of last week. So we're currently in the process of reviewing all those comments and developing our final recommendation for the State Water Control Board. A couple of other rulemakings that are underway in the water quality standards arena. They were approved by the State Water Control Board last year, so they are pending currently executive review and then EPA approval. Those are the criteria on cadmium for aquatic life, bacteria for the recreation use, and a number of human health criteria as well as the ammonia criteria. The ammonia criteria included a phased implementation plan. You remember I mentioned that, you may remember that I mentioned that last year, that specifies on how these criteria would be implemented in our discharge permits. Because we pulled that rulemaking out, there is currently a separate tracking mechanism established. So if you're looking for any of these on the Virginia Regulatory Town Hall, you may have to search for both. I wanted to mention on the bacteria criteria, there was a change in terms of assessment methodology that looks at more frequent sampling, so that has a potential impact on our monitoring programs, and we're currently evaluating some options for us. We're planning this summer to go out and do some pilot studies to see how we would incorporate that into our regular ambient monitoring program moving forward, so that's new. The other thing I wanted to mention with respect to the criteria approval process, you may be aware, and this is another session that is going to be happening later on here this week, about the federal recognition of several of the Virginia tribes. So tribal consultation is a new element in EPA's approval process for our criteria, and we're also engaging the tribes in working with them on how to coordinate on those rulemakings and EPA approval actions. So that is going to be a new element of the approval for criteria moving forward and other EPA actions. So what's coming up in water quality standards? We have a lot of, we've worked on a lot of very complex rulemakings over the last several years. It doesn't look like the next few years will be any easier or more straightforward in terms of just the complexity of what's being proposed and what EPA is developing. 2 criteria for aquatic life have been recently recommended by EPA. One is for selenium and one for aluminum. On the selenium criteria, we're still awaiting EPA technical support for implementation. Again, the criteria are very complex, and there's some question as to how they will be implemented for permitting and assessment and monitoring and all those questions that attach to criteria. So the technical support document is very important in terms of for us to adopt the criteria for Virginia. And similarly, the aluminum criteria are very complex there. Instead of having an assumption of background water quality conditions that would result in just one number, EPA is actually proposing a range of acceptable acute and chronic values based on normalized toxicity data. And if you want to just take a look at what that looks like, if you have a permit that might be impacted by this, there is an Excel calculator that EPA has put online that you might want to use to just explore that a little bit more. So both of these issues will be things that we might include in our next triennial review process. And in addition to that, we also ask for comment or suggestions for any other topics that we might consider moving forward on our water quality standards updates. And we asked for some comments last fall, and we did receive comments from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and the James River Association that we will consider when we move forward with our next triennial review. The next topic I wanted to just briefly mention is our integrated water quality report. You may know, or you may be aware, that we've just recently public noticed our 2018 report. The comment period closed at the end of February. This report covered the monitoring period from 2011 through 2016, and once every 6 years or so, we include a trend chapter, which was included in this year's report, that looks at 20 years of data to kind of see if we can find any trends in water quality across the Commonwealth. We continue to find opportunities to delist waters, which I think shows the dedication across the Commonwealth for implementing BMPs and doing what can be done for water quality improvements. Which is encouraging. And similarly, the trend analysis seem to show some promising trends in addressing nutrients and and sediment across Virginia. Of course, more work needs to be done, but we take the good news when we can get it. That integrated report was also presented to the public in a webinar, and that is also available online to you if you're interested in that. We are currently preparing our comment response document and hope to submit the final to EPA in early summer of 2019. And, we're not resting on our laurels, so we're kicking off the 2020 integrated report shortly thereafter and hope to have that developed back in the Clean Water Act deadline by April of 2020. That's what we're aiming for right now. Okay, some more pictures. Moving on to water supply. David mentioned the groundwater efforts that have been going on, and I do have a couple of slides on that and where we go from here. I did want to talk a little bit about water supply planning and analysis before I go there. And there is another session on groundwater issues and water supply issues that Scott Cutlass is presenting at, and again, that I would encourage you to attend that session for some more information and more deeper dive into these issues. So what's going on in water supply planning and analysis? We completed a water supply review of the water supply plans this past year. In 2015, we developed a state water resources plan that was based on water supply plans submitted by localities. Sometimes there were regional plans by a group of localities that worked together. And almost all of those local water supply plans had some conditions in them. There were things that weren't quite complete or needed some additional information or some clarification that we asked the localities to provide to us. And the due date for that was this year, and all of the localities met those conditions, and all of the water supply plans have now been found compliant, which is a really big milestone for us. This is sort of the halfway point for us, and we will be preparing an update of the State Water Resources Plan that's due next year. As part of that, we will be looking both at the new information that was provided by the planning units, localities, or regions, and we're also looking at improving some of our tools that we have to evaluate the information that we receive, primarily as it relates to cumulative impact analysis. And so just to give you an idea of the timeline that we're looking at for that process, we currently are working hard on QA/QC of the data that we've received and improving our modeling tools. We're hoping to have a stakeholder meeting later this year to talk about different metrics that we have developed and hope to use for this next update of the State Water Resources Plan and the methods for cumulative impact analysis. We would then move into the modeling first quarter of 2020 and report out to the stakeholders on the results and recommendations in the second quarter of 2020 with the goal of having a draft plan for public review in the summer or early fall. We also, in the area of water withdrawal permitting and compliance, I mentioned last time that we, were completing a draft guidance. That guidance has been finalized and talks about how do we assess compliance, how do we do inspections, how do we assign points for various degrees of violations. The guidance is available on Town Hall, so if you're interested to take a look, feel free to look there or contact any of the staff at DEQ. We're moving, similar to the other programs at DEQ, to employ a risk-based inspection strategy, and some of the factors that we're looking at are, first-time permittee, how many compliance points are assessed, are there any maintenance issues, those kinds of details. And then we follow the regular path for non-compliance actions that you can see here with requests for corrective action, warning letter, and notice of violation. So it's new for us. It's not really new for DEQ as a whole, but we're happy to have this process in place now and formalized in guidance so we can staff up a little bit more and start moving out on these inspections. And then on the current past legislative session, we also had a bill, Senate Bill 1599, that was signed by the governor just this past weekend. And the bill directs the State Water Control Board to adopt regulations providing incentives to use the Surficial Aquifer on the Eastern Shore. This was a topic that came up as part of our compliance assistance framework that we did over the past several years that showed that there were a lot of withdrawals on the Eastern Shore that caused concerns about the sustainability. And so this bill, we believe, will be one of the tools that we will have to encourage people to withdraw water from the Columbia Aquifer, which is a Surficial Aquifer, and may be more sustainable in the long term. The bill asks, or the requirements that go along with that for incentives are, for example, longer permit terms, an accelerated permit process, or discounted permit fees or subsidies or other incentives. So we're working on an implementation plan for that new law now, and planning to move forward toward implementation in the summer and fall. And I'm just looking at the time here. I did have a few other groundwater topics that I'm just going to list and then be available to maybe answer some questions down the road. We had a requirement or by letter for an evaluation of the human consumption priority that we have for our withdrawal programs. This was a requirement that came out of the last General Assembly and asked for a report by October 31 of last year to evaluate how do we interpret the relevant sections of the Code of Virginia that deal with this issue, and what are the practical implications on how DEQ interprets those sections. We convened a stakeholder group and had several meetings to discuss these issues and come up with some recommendations, which we did and reported back. And again, that report is available if you're interested in any more details on that. Also, out of the 2018 General Assembly was a requirement for a new technical evaluation for subdivisions with 30 or more lots. That also passed and provides some more technical robustness on those larger numbers of withdrawals in one geographic area. We have completed the implementation plan for that and have been moving forward with that over the last year. Again, there is some more detail that will be provided in the session that Scott Cutlass is leading later on in this conference. And then the annual Groundwater Forum is something that we started last year to bring people together and give them updates on a regular basis on what we know about groundwater. You know, David mentioned the success that we've had with the negotiated permits over the last year. Of course, groundwater is continued to be withdrawn. We learn new things every day. There may be new permit applications that get submitted. So we want to keep up to date, and we want to keep our stakeholders up to date on what we know and what is driving some of the decision-making with respect to withdrawals from those coastal plain aquifers. And I think I will stop here. Again, the other topics, withdrawal reporting and the Eastern Shore poultry farms, if there's any questions on that, I'm happy to answer those in the Q&A session, and I'll turn it over back to Jeff.
Okay, next up is Melanie Davenport, our Director of Water Permitting. Wait, something's here. Take it away.
What do we do? We just hit
Yeah, you can just hit.
that?
No.
No. Enter?
You just.
Gotcha. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for bearing with us. I had to laugh. I agree with what Dave Paylor said. It feels like We have been spending a lot of time and not working on things much other than pipelines, but in fact, the Water Permitting Division has a whole host of exciting things that are underway. We're a very regulatorily and general permit active division, so I always get a chance to come up here and go through a long list of projects that we're working on. We have actually tweaked the format for this session a little bit. I'm going to spend about 15 or 20 minutes on the highlights, and if you're keeping track of time, we will have a significant chunk of time when we're done for questions. So if there's a particular general permit or an issue related that I haven't touched upon, I encourage you to ask us, and then we are all here really looking forward to having a conversation with you guys once we have gone through the highlights. So hopefully you won't disappoint us. The first thing I wanted to mention is the construction general permit. This is the permit that is required for any and all land disturbing activity that is 1 acre or greater. This was a big deal when this permit was first reissued back in 2014. In my mind, that was kind of the beginning of the modern era of how Virginia handles stormwater. And what the 2014 permit did for the first time is it requires an incorporation before permit issuance of a stormwater management plan, which means that for any of this land development and land construction and development, you have to have an approved post-construction stormwater plan, which means we have to agree up front, and I say we, whether it's DEQ serving as the local stormwater authority or in a number of cases the municipality. We have taken a look at what your plans are for post-construction quality and quantity, and we have said, yes, those plans meet the requirements of the Virginia Stormwater Management Act. So when this permit was reissued back in 2014, we had a lot of conversations about it. There were multiple sessions at this conference. There was a lot of conversation throughout the Commonwealth. And I personally can't believe it was 5 years ago that we issued that permit, because we are now on the cusp of reissuing that permit, because it expires on June 31st of this year. So we are in the process of adopting the regulation that reissues that permit. The State Water Control Board authorized us to proceed to public participation back in September of 2018. We had a public comment period that ran end of October till end of December. 41 individuals submitted about 150 comments. When we did this permit issuance in 2014, we had hundreds of commenters and thousands of comments. We're going through what those comments are, tweaking the regulation to the extent that it's appropriate, and we will be proposing that final regulation, that final revised construction general permit to the State Water Control Board in about 2.5 weeks on April 15th. And as I said, this new permit becomes effective July 1st, 2019. If you have coverage under the existing permit, you will need to get that permit reissued. One of the challenges we have is we can't finalize our registration statement for the next permit cycle until the State Water Control Board has moved forward with its final adoption of the reg. There is a draft registration statement out on the DEQ website, but just be warned, it could tweak a little bit because we don't know exactly what that permit looks like until the State Water Control Board makes its final vote next month. But we think there's about 6,000 active permits out there that will need reissuance. So it's going to be a fun summer for the construction GP. In a related vein, back in 2016, the General Assembly directed DEQ to take a look at the underlying statutory authority for both our erosion and sediment control and our stormwater programs, and asked us to perhaps make two pretty complicated programs a bit more easily understood. We convened a stakeholder advisory group, and legislation was passed in 2016 that I refer to as the consolidated legislation, and it essentially brings in common elements of both E&S and stormwater and kind of frames them up properly in the context of the state water control law, because the way those programs grew, they were kind of mishmashed into one piece of legislation, and there was a lot of internal inconsistency, and they were very, very clunky. That legislation passed in 2016, except it was delayed again the next year because of other issues that the General Assembly was looking at, and its ultimate implementation is going to be effective once DEQ adopts the regulations that are necessary to implement that consolidated statute. So we have finally published our Notice of Intended Regulatory Action for development of those consolidated regs. We published it back in February. The comment period closed on March 6th. We are currently looking at those comments and putting together our regulatory advisory panel, and we expect to kick off that action mid-May. It sounds really intriguing, but I just want everybody to understand we are not taking another look at any of the technical requirements. It is really more of an administrative streamlining to figure out how do we now edit the regs so it's consistent with this concept of a consolidated E&S and stormwater program. We've had, I want to say, about 40 folks volunteered to participate on the RAP, and we are taking a look at all of that right now. The other thing we are doing, both in concert with the upcoming reissuance of the construction general permit, and also just recognizing that we have been in the business of implementing the new VSMP regulations for about 5 years. We're in the process of scheduling a number of outreach meetings throughout the Commonwealth. We are going to be reaching out to our local stormwater management authorities, and we expect that we'll have all of those scheduled, and they should kick off towards the end of May and run through June. They will be geographically based. We will be communicating with the folks who are on our database as VSMP program administrators. So keep an eye out for that if you would like to get in a room with those of us that implement this program from DEQ's point of view and have some conversations about what the new permit will require, and sort of get a look at how the program has been running for the last 5 years. Manufactured treatment devices, this has been an interesting issue where these are constructed devices, boxes, filter systems. They are not the engineered kinds of things like ponds and detention basins. And we had some challenges when we initiated the 2014 requirements because we don't really have a framework for evaluating the effectiveness and the efficiency of MTDs, and without having them approved, projects couldn't use them for post-construction stormwater controls. So we issued an interim guidance back in 2014 for how we are going to evaluate manufactured treatment devices and allow them to be used in post-construction. We have spent a few years working through that guidance. We know where it works, we know where it doesn't work, so we're actually going to be revising that guidance to incorporate our findings and evaluations and how it's been working. And we have something called the BMP Clearinghouse, which is a technical advisory group that is noticed on the website. You get notices of it on the town hall if this is something you're interested in. But we're going to be presenting some updated draft guidance next month at our BMP Clearinghouse meeting. Biosolids, I wanted to touch on that. A number of the biosolid permits that are currently in existence were effective somewhere about 10 years ago, and they are 10-year permits. So at the end of November, we issued a guidance document which helps us lay out the concepts that we'll follow as we come up to many of these permits in terms of their reissuance. So that first 10-year term is expiring for a lot of those permits, and we just wanted everybody to know how we're going to proceed with permit reissuance. Applications are due 180 days before the permit expires. We looked at what needs to be updated, what doesn't need to be updated, when will informational public meetings be held. So it's just the details of how we're going to go ahead with reissuing those permits, because this is the first time we'll be reissuing the permits under the revised biosolids regulations. To me, the bottom line is that all reissuances will require an opportunity for folks to request a public hearing. We're also currently doing some work with our general permit for poultry houses. That is our VPA permit, our Virginia Pollution Abatement Permit, which is different than the VIPDES permit that some poultry houses will be required to get based on their operations. A lot of the poultry houses in Virginia actually operate under this VPA general permit, which requires on-site management of manure, or if it's off-site management, there are requirements for brokers and end users. And a VPA permit relates to a facility that does not discharge. So that permit expires in November of 2020, and just yesterday we kicked off our technical advisory committee to look at the terms of what that next 10-year permit should be for poultry houses. We've also been busy on the front of municipal stormwater. We have 11 Phase 1 MS4 localities in the Commonwealth. They have individual permits. The other approximately 100 MS4 entities operate under a general permit, and that general permit was just reissued effective November 1st of 2018. We really had to struggle to implement something called EPA's remand rule, which meant that historically the permit required the MS4 to submit a program plan, and we approved that program plan outside of permit coverage, and what the remand rule said, you can't do that. So what we have done is we have woven into this reissuance of the permit those elements that define maximum extent practicable, such that there's sort of a list of things. So as an MS4, in order to meet your education and public outreach requirement, for example, you will deem that you've demonstrated that if you've done one in a list of maybe 5 or 6 things. So there's more substance incorporated into the permit than we have historically done, but the substance itself isn't that different. We are working on updated guidance for the Chesapeake Bay TMDL action plan, and they have to be submitted by November 1st of this year, so stay tuned, and we will be updating the guidance we currently have on that. We have a couple other recently reissued or being reissued general permits. The concrete products facility general permit was effective as of January 1st of this year. And there are some updated stormwater requirements. We have taken the requirements out of EPA's 2015 multi-sector general permit, and that's how we always do these general permits. We see what's going on at the federal level, and we incorporate those requirements. The same time, January of this year, the pesticide discharge general permit was reissued, and there were no substantive modifications to that. And that's one of those permits, if you are utilizing a pesticide that is designed to be used in water, you have to have a permit. And there's automatic coverage for that permit, which means no registration is required. We are taking to the board a couple permits next month. One is the non-metallic mineral mining general permit. That current permit expires at the end of June. There are mostly minor updates to that permit, but the big one, in addition to the construction general permit that will be before the State Water Control Board next month, is the industrial stormwater general permit. I have a host of bullets here, but there's 2 things that hopefully come up in bold, and those are the things I just wanted to point out. The first is that all dischargers that are covered by this permit that are in the Chesapeake Bay and subject to the TMDL have to submit calculations to us. For any facilities where those calculations are above TSS, total nitrogen or total phosphorus loading values, they have to submit an implementation, they have to submit an action plan so they can get on track to start making reductions, which will need to be met by June 30th of 2024. We also did add a waiver for annual reporting if the data that has been collected in the last permit cycle shows that that facility is well within the loading requirements. And there's also an opportunity for the first time for these facilities to purchase nutrient credits. And if they're purchasing a perpetual nutrient credit, then we don't continue to require them to conduct sampling. The other thing I wanted to mention is the last one, which is if you happen to have a facility that operates under the Industrial Stormwater General Permit, the registration statements are due by May 2nd of 2019. And the 2019 version of that registration statement is available on our website. And again, there might be some tweaks based on what happens at the board meeting, but we wanted to get at least the best and most likely version out there for folks. Wanted to mention, too, that there was language in the budget bill of this year which eliminates, so in our current VIPTES permit regulation, there's a requirement that says if you need time, if a facility needs time to meet a water quality-based effluent limit, then the time in which they have to achieve that is one permit term. And that one permit term was removed by language in the budget, so we have initiated a regulatory amendment to the VIPTES reg, which we anticipate to have done by October 1st of this year. And then I also wanted to mention there's been a lot of activity at the federal level. It's the NPDES program rule. It was published in February of this year. I think one of the biggest things to me, they looked at a whole host of issues in updating that rule, some of which were very, very controversial. So EPA kind of backed off on the controversial part of that. But there's one of the things that I think is particularly interesting is that for the first time ever, public notices can be published on a permitting agency's website in lieu of newspaper notice. So to me, that's kind of a big recognition that we are in the 21st century. Jutta touched on this, the revised ammonia criteria. It was approved by the State Water Control Board in December of last year. It's not effective yet. From a permitting point of view, there is phased implementation of this criteria. And the first way it's phased in is based on size of facilities. So the larger facilities have a shorter amount of time to assess and figure out what they need to do and actually meet the criteria. There's also an implementation plan that looks at things like funding and capacity, especially because a number of smaller localities and their sewage treatment plants are going to have to upgrade. So that's phased implementation. We've got quite a bit about that on the website, or if you have questions, feel free to ask. The other thing, we have had a draft regulation that we've been working on for a couple years regarding certification of non-point source nutrient credits. This has been a fairly lengthy process, partly because if we go down the regulatory road and make substantive changes at certain points in the process, we re-trigger public notice, comment, and executive review. The short story, though, on this is the governor's executive review was completed earlier this month, and that's for taking a revised proposed permit out. So hopefully we will be public noticing comments on that regulation. So if that's something you're interested in, keep an eye out for that. The other thing I wanted to just quickly mention is that the General Assembly passed two pieces of legislation which will trigger amendments to the Virginia Water Protection Permit Regulation. The first is we were directed to add a permitting exclusion for certain activities in stormwater management facilities. The idea being that somebody has constructed a stormwater management facility, and there's been some vegetative growth and they have to go in and manage it, well, the idea is that they're excluded from having to get a Virginia Water Protection Permit to do that maintenance on their BMP. And then the General Assembly also added permitting requirements for certain natural gas transmission pipeline facilities. And we will be making sure that the reg is consistent with those legislative actions. And I am the only one, because we didn't know the order, I'm the only one whose last slide doesn't say questions. But I am on my last slide. And am I free to say the floor is open for questions? Okay. I'm not going to show that one.
Okay. Okay, before the floor does open for questions, if I could get a couple DEQ folks to volunteer to take mics up on both sides, since we've got them down here, but it's kind of awkward to try to get people to come down. And while they're doing that, I just wanted to kind of make a couple extra remarks and expand upon a couple things that were said. First of all, in working with the tribes, we've been really doing a lot in the last 6 months, coordinating with EPA. If you come to the session later on tribal relations, EPA's has the ability to do consultation with the tribes on actions. Jutta alluded to it with the standards, and so they can actually ask EPA for a consultation. And what does that mean? Well, they're basically, asking questions, trying to get clarification, and EPA Region 3, this is the first, Virginia's tribes are the first ones that have actually recognized tribes in the region, so they're kind of working and learning as we go. We have monthly meetings and calls with EPA and with headquarters, who's got a lot of experience in this area. But on top of that, Virginia has been trying to reach out on projects where we know there's tribes, some of the recognized tribes in the area of a potential permit action. We had one draft air permit where we reached out to the tribes to, answer questions and get input from them as even though that's kind of really EPA's thing, we really want to try to recognize and do that with them. And a couple things just on enforcement, and we don't have a whole section on that, on the enforcement division, but in my acting role, I just want to say a couple things. First of all, we continue to go along and, assuring compliance is the bottom line when it comes to enforcement. Getting someone back into compliance is our main objective, and that's what we strive for. We continue to try to make sure we're doing this equitably and that we're consistent across our regions. And in all of our programs, I think we really strive to try to be consistent. And we have in all of our programs, our management groups within those programs have a call at least monthly, and they go through issues to make sure that we're trying to make sure that we're applying guidance the right way, answer questions, and that type of thing. So, if you feel like you're dealing with DEQ and there's an issue, always feel free to call the region or call us in central office, and we'll try to answer questions, because we really do try to do that. On the enforcement side, we are, we've had a little uptick, and I'll just say that we've got some facilities that we deal with that maybe might be repeat offenders, or things continue to go on where there's seriousness in the uptick of noncompliance of a particular facility or permittee necessitates it going to the Attorney General's office as a referral. So, the vast majority of how we go through the enforcement process and resolve noncompliance is through the administrative process and doing consent agreements. But, we have some instances where this, administratively we cannot have stipulated penalties in our orders, but we really feel like that's a tool which the Attorney General's office does have in filing these things in court, where we have the ability to go back and assess stipulated penalties for noncompliance. And we take that very seriously, because we've had some facilities that they maybe not complying with the order that they've agreed to, or this is the second, third time they're with us in a short period of time. So I just say that as a recognition that we do take noncompliance seriously, and the normal way that we try to resolve that through the administrative process is still ongoing, and it's the way we like to do business, to try to, compliance is what we're after. But we have the ability and are using the ability to refer certain matters to the Attorney General's office. So I just wanted to add that and as a kind of an update from our enforcement programs. So with that said now, we have till 3 o'clock. It's 2:24 to be exact. So we have a lot of time left for questions and dialogue. So who's the first one that's got? I can't see good with the lights, so I'm going to depend on Sharon and, okay. Three seconds. Shouts.
This question is for Schneider and Davenport. There's been a lot of buzz about PFAS, polyfluoroalkyl substances that are shown up in groundwater. And EPA has talked about it with the Drinking Water Act, MCL. Is there talk at the state level about looking into this at all?
Basically.
The question is really for Justin.
So we are actually, as an agency, we are involved in really trying to assess and understand the PFAS, PFOA. Those are the two significant, well, they're a series of many compounds, a family of compounds of emerging contaminants that have been making a lot of news nationally. EPA has its plan that it's rolling out. Our different state associations, like ASWAMA, with Justin is familiar with, and Aqua, which Melanie and Jutta are actively members with, are all working the states together to try to come up with strategies of what do we do is, we don't have an MCL. The federal government EPA is about ready to actually is going through the process of at least calling it determining that it is a hazardous substance under search, so that there's some ability to start looking at it and how we clean it up. We've been mostly dealing with it with federal facilities. We've had a couple in Virginia that we've been dealing with that have I think made the news. And so we're trying to work through strategies. We're trying to develop an internal agency work group on emerging contaminants and how we should be addressing that, and working with VDH, the health department, our partners with that. We have VIPD's permits that may discharge upstream of a public water intake, and there's concerns about what's the quality of that effluent. There's nothing new as far as PFAS, PFOA. It's been around a long time, and it's ubiquitous in the environment, and we're really trying to understand what that means. And obviously, Virginia, we don't have the ability to do research, and we depend on EPA to really do that research and tell us. But the first thing is to look at, where do we think we have issues in Virginia, and how are we going to deal with those?
Thanks. It's working. I also wanted to ask Director Paylor, and I was a couple minutes late, so I'm sorry if you covered this and I missed it, but it seems like there's been an uptick in applications for renewable energy projects under the permit by rule. Can you fill us in on that, and do you see that continuing?
Yes, I covered it. There has been an uptick. We have a whole lot of applications for solar facilities lined up. I haven't heard the latest count. One time I heard 40 not too long ago. So it's increasing more and more. And the cost is going down, and so that really is going to be a key component of our climate initiative as well.
My name's Scott Hoppy. This is a question for Director Paylor. You had a slide that showed point source emissions dropping dramatically since 2012. Was that for water or for air?
I'm sorry, that was for air.
Okay. What are our state emissions per kilowatt hour for carbon emissions right now? Do you know?
I do not know.
Okay.
Sorry.
Right, well, you're doing a great job because I come from California and they're paying a fortune for electricity, and our emissions aren't that much worse than theirs. So keep up the good work.
Thank you. Okay, we can all adjourn now?
There was a question in the front here.
With these new solar energy projects, are they going to have to follow runoff?
That's a Melanie question.
Yes, any land disturbing activity that exceeds, that is 1 acre or more. Before they start research, they have to have approved. Did it go off? No. They have to have erosion and sediment control plan and post-construction stormwater quality and quantity before we give them coverage under that construction permit. So yes.
Will that take into account changing forest land to grassland?
Yes, it will, and it will also take into account how much impervious surface there might be, depending on the size of the facility or how they've designed it. Some are building and paving roads.
And that's the same thing, this is a jumping question now, but that's the same thing for the gas pipeline.
Yes, we have our post-construction water quality requirements are really based on land use. We utilize something called the runoff reduction methodology, but what it does is it looks at pre-construction land use, and the primary kinds are forest, meadow grassland, and then impervious and maintain turf. And what you do is an analysis and see how the quality changes, and then we have requirements in terms of what off-site receiving streams can handle in terms of quantity.
Unless that has changed, the initial submittals from the gas pipelines were trying to claim that changing forest to scrubland created no additional runoff. I don't know if that's been corrected. I keep trying to follow this process, but it's like moving target.
Well, we certainly ran all that through that runoff reduction methodology, and if you've got some specific questions, I can certainly look into getting you some more of the details. I'd be happy to do that.
Next question.
Hello, this question is probably for, well, I guess I'll ask you all. Based on a comment I heard from Mr. Williams, we're trying to reduce pharmaceuticals in the sewage systems. Could anyone speak to the intention or conversations that Virginia DEQ has had regarding reduction of pharmaceutical constituent or metabolites released or discharged into ground surface or potable networks?
So I'll start. The one particular provision that I was speaking about is based off the changes federally in the hazardous waste regs, where there had been historical potential by virtue of Clean Water Act applicability, the option of managing those pharmaceuticals through disposal, where it would ultimately go through some sort of wastewater treatment plant or similar system. And that sewer ban is specific to a requirement of the waste regs on the pharmaceutical side about how that waste can or can't be managed. So we get at it in terms of how the waste, in that particular instance, pharmaceuticals or others, can be managed in terms of their disposal option, be it landfilling or otherwise. Typically, though, as you would imagine, where there's cross-media in terms of applicability of another program, that program's requirements then step in to what can or can't be managed through a particular system. So I'll give it to those folks.
As I think Jeff mentioned, Jutta and I were actually up at a meeting with our other air water directors nationally just last week, and I think there is a recognition and a bit of a frustration with what's generally referred to as emerging contaminants. And one of the reasons it's a challenge is because the amount of research and analysis and time and effort that goes in at the federal level to develop a new criterion is just mind-boggling. I mean, it can be years and years and years, and that's what serves the basis for any water quality standards that the Commonwealth might adopt. There's also a challenge with a number of emerging contaminants that nobody really has invested yet the time and money in figuring out what's the treatment technology to remove those things from the waste stream. I mean, those metabolites come out of us. They're because we have prescriptions because, my foot hurts or whatever. I mean, it's just, and I think what we were saying as states is that we really expect and need federal leadership on that, but recognize that the time and money is just enormous to start developing some of that. So we have a sense of frustration too.
Next question. This side's been quiet, so we need some questions over.
Yeah, I must have picked the wrong side.
Okay.
So for the industrial stormwater discharge permits, so they're being updated soon, and they're also coming around to their 10-year turnover. Does that include them submitting site maps and permit area coverage to the local BSMP/MS4?
We will be taking the final proposed GP to the State Water Control Board next month. I honestly would have to double check as to whether there were any changes to that language in this permit based on the one that we issued in 2014. And again, give me your card. I can probably pull it up while we're here and we can circle back. But I'm happy to check to see if there was any change in that requirement.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. I don't talk very loud. I had actually a Chesapeake Bay question. You had mentioned the updating the draft guidance, the guidance document for putting together the action plans. And my understanding is it's going to be like more of a public comment period maybe with it this time, or where there'd be some back and forth. I wasn't sure if you had a feel for what the scope of the changes might involve. We have several of the draft phase 1 action plans that were submitted that we hadn't received approval for yet, so I just wasn't sure how that might tie in.
So you're talking about the MS4 TMDL action plans? Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
Yes.
So we are currently working on Arlington's reissuance of its individual permit, and that is the first IP that is coming up for reissuance. So we worked through a lot of issues with the Phase 2 general permit, and we're incorporating those into the individuals as they come up. We need to update the guidance document, and we actually had, I seem to remember we had a fairly robust conversation with the MS4s when we drafted it, but when that guidance gets amended, yes. Not only did we engage folks, but there's actually a new state law that kicked in as of January 1st of this year, which necessitates a 30-day public comment period on any proposed guidance. We would rather have MS4's input before we put anything to paper. So yes, we will be reaching out to talk to folks about that guidance document.
Great. And then I had one follow-up question, but it might be for you to, it was related to your comment earlier that the 2018 report, you had a lot of reduced nutrient and sediment in the local waterways. And I was wondering if you had seen anything related to that with like more delistings of waterways coming up. Like, is it that good? The air slides are really good, so just kind of.
So I don't have the numbers at the top of my head in terms of delistings. So we did have delistings. Those would have been mostly related to either bacteria or the aquatic life use impairments. You know, we don't typically list waters as impaired specifically for nutrients or sediment. Those are usually things that we identify as stressors that impact aquatic life. So, but yes, we've had delistings for both of those criteria in local waterways. And, you know, we continue to see that trend, you know, really every time we reissue a report. So, you know, we are making progress in those local waterways in terms of restoration.
Okay, great, good news, thank you.
Next question. Anybody in the balcony want to shout out a question?
I
Got
want
one over
to take that pharmaceutical question up again. Would you consider issuing some best practices on how the population could proceed in either giving back unused pharmaceuticals, especially in view of opioids and cancer drugs and so on? Pharmacies say absolutely not, we're not taking anything back. The suggestion with kitty litter and the landfill doesn't seem to be very practical for sick people to do. Could you please issue something to the public more forcefully and more generally understood what we can do with even the aspirins that we have in many houses? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that certainly as we roll out and move forward with this pharmaceutical rule change at the federal level, some of the options that it allows for should help facilitate some of that individual take-back opportunity because it deals with the DEA take-back options as well as that reverse distribution. And hopefully by providing some clarity will allow pharmaceutical to be taken back at pharmacies where they might have been hesitant before. But certainly I think it's going to help to also feed a broader conversation to both make sure that pharmacies are aware of their options and individuals as well are aware of their options in terms of best management practices and so forth. So it's really helped to clear the air, and I think we'll be able to use that to provide a lot of outreach and information to folks who manage those at all levels.
And DEQ certainly supports programs where local communities have drug take-back days where local law enforcement works with the community to offer those opportunities to bring back unused prescriptions for proper disposal. Yes?
So DEA runs a website. You can look up pharmacies in your area that take them back. Walgreens is a common one, but DEA has that information online. It's sometimes in the hospital, but this pharmacies in the community that take them back whenever they're open.
Right, and part of that too, though, is hopefully by clarifying some of the applicability, because there was concern before about those programs and the hazardous waste element. It'll help to open those up even more, and aside from the mail-back programs, which some pharmacies have, but also just the individual take-back days that pharmacy have, particularly because of the concerns with management over controlled substance like opioids and others. So should hopefully help open up the opportunities for proper management and returns across the board.
Next question. There's,
I don't know if I need a mic, but no. So Colonel Pat Kinsman, Commander Norfolk District, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, appreciate the great panel, appreciate our, again, relationship with DEQ. One note earlier on the tribal engagement, as a federal agency, we're doing that as well in early April, and so there might be some opportunities to collaborate as we are engaging the newly recognized tribes. Second point, I guess, in terms of, again, I'm a Virginia Symposium newcomer, just been in the job here about 10 months and learning a ton. You know, to our 30th anniversary here and our mission, I think I found it, I think in general, the general's remarks here, does it say to network, learn, and collaborate to solve our complex environmental challenges. To your, Dave, you probably know the audience better than I do, but how can we help, you know, DEQ in terms of, you know, achieving your respective mission across the state?
Well, it's a great question, because that's something that we need to be doing more and more across the Commonwealth. And, I think probably collectively, you and I could put our heads together and figure out how we can communicate, maybe through our websites, maybe through press or whatever, what's going on jointly, and maybe even find some opportunities to get some feedback from the public as well. So I would welcome that discussion, and let's have it, and let's see what we can do.
There's another question in the front.
You mentioned environmental justice. I don't know if that was directed at the Buckingham pumping facility that's being worked on. Somebody told me this morning that they're already turning dirt up. So I assume that they have gotten all the permits that they have to have, except that the pipeline itself doesn't have the permits it's supposed to have. So how does a project like that get started when the people I work for can't put in a driveway until they've gotten all of their permits, not, the well permit, the septic permit, the house. You've got a mom and pop gas station that they can't turn over any dirt for any part of their project until the entire thing is approved. That, I understand it's a big project and you got a lot of parts to it, but it seems like every part should be approved and ready to go before that first dirt is turned over. And you can look at it from every, and that's just the ACP that I'm really talking about. I live in Nelson County. They've already cut down trees up there at the Wintergreen entrance. There's a section that they were, my understanding, I could be all, they were supposed to cut one segment, and then they went 90 degrees and cut up another mountainside that was not in their area of clearing. I understand they did a lot of that in many areas in Augusta County, in wetland areas, and that's just the ACP. You start talking about the MVP, and they've got mud on the highways, in the creeks. You talked about the AG is supposed to have, he's supposed to kick in there and actually take these items to court if that's the case. Is that how this is supposed to be handled? It seems to me that every permit should be in place, because that's how the projects I work on have to be.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions in there. And I haven't heard, as far as Buckingham is concerned, I have not heard if they're moving dirt or not. And I'd be happy to talk about, any specific questions that you have offline too. It is, in fact, as sort of technically and legally complicated an issue as we deal with, because you've got so many federal permits as well as state permits and that sort of thing. So I think you've hit the nail on the head that to the extent that they may be doing some things, it has to do with maybe multiple, in some cases, overlapping authorities and jurisdictions. I will say in all cases that we have we've hired extra staff and contractors to do the compliance piece, and so we are for MVP, and when it starts happening with ACP, we'll have a heavy compliance component, and we're getting very useful help from the public as well in terms of identifying when there are compliance issues that we have to address.
Next question. We still have 10 minutes. One in the back.
Hello. I guess this might be for Mr. Paylor. I think I read recently that community solar projects are not allowed under Virginia state law, and if that's correct, I'm talking about, you know, as opposed to a large-scale project that, like the one in Spotsylvania, something more community-based where locals can buy into it. If those aren't allowed in Virginia, is that going to change in the future?
I probably shouldn't turn this off. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question. It might be a State Corporation Commission issue and not ours. We deal with applications for solar projects that are less than 150 megawatts, and we look at it from the environmental component of it. So I don't know that DEQ has anything to say about community or otherwise. I think that is an SCC question.
Hi, Ann Swanson with the Chesapeake Bay Commission. Question on a totally different subject. A few years back, the Washington Council of Governments approached us about a piece of legislation that would just relabel these unwoven wipes because they're being marketed as flushable, when in fact they're not. And the municipalities came to us and showed us hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of maintenance costs that they were having to pay because of these, what they called fatbergs, developing in the pipe system that they would then have to unravel, essentially, and remove. And anyway, the legislation in the nth hour died due to opposition from the manufacturers. But I'm curious if in Virginia you've had a lot of problems with those unwoven wipes. And I mostly ask it because if hundreds of thousands of dollars is being paid for maintenance, that could be going to reduction technologies and pollution control.
I have never heard of a situation where one of our POTWs has spoken to DEQ, to me, to our compliance staff about a violation or a problem as a result of, what did you call them, fatbergs? Yeah. Which doesn't mean it might not be out there. I go and speak to our Association of Municipal Wastewater Operators. We go 3 or 4 times a year. It's never come up. I'm curious now, and I will start asking questions. Okay. I'll start asking. Thanks.
Another question over in the back.
Thank you.
A couple more questions. We have time for a few more. Oh, I got a question back in the middle.
So, any word on when our next coal plant is going to close?
There was something in the paper today. Yeah, there was actually an article online and in the Times-Dispatch, this Richmond Times-Dispatch this morning about, I don't remember the number, but it was multiple, you know, like 5, 6, or 7. The small coal-fired plants. I mean, we still have 3 large ones that I can think of that are going to continue operating, but there is Dominion Power announced that they're going to be closing a lot of their smaller coal-fired plants because they don't need them now because of the switch over to natural gas. I don't remember the exact number, but it's a timely question because it came up just today.
Ten units.
Thank you.
That was 10 units that are closing, and that's straight from Dominion.
Can we eke out one more question? One last question. Somebody's got to have something. No? All right. Thank you.